The first thing Eli Mercer heard was not the creek. It was the silence around it. On most January evenings in Asheville, Vermont, Asheville Creek spoke for itself, muttering under ice, ticking against stones, breathing fog into the spruce trees over the bend behind the old mill road. But that evening the creek had gone strangely quiet, as if the cold had pressed one careful finger to its mouth. Even the crows had left the pasture fence. Even the wind seemed to hold back from the hollow, where the water curved under a shelf of blue-white ice. Eli stood halfway down the bank with his lantern in one gloved hand, listening to something he could not yet name. Then the sound came again. A thin scrape. Not loud. Not desperate in the way people expected fear to sound. Just one brittle touch of claw against ice, followed by a low, swallowed breath from somewhere beneath the mist. Eli did not move. He was 56, broad through the shoulders, slow from an old logging injury in his left knee, and careful in the way men became careful when life had already taken one person they loved. His wife, June, had been gone 3 winters. Since then, Eli had spoken mostly to his tools, to the stove when it smoked, and to the chipped blue mug he carried around the house. That evening, he had only come down to check the culvert after a hard freeze. The road crew had warned that the bend might jam. A frozen creek could rise without making a fuss, and Eli knew quiet did not always mean peace. Another scrape came from the bend. The lantern flame quivered inside its glass. Eli lowered it toward the ice, and the yellow light slid over reeds, broken snow crust, and the dark crescent where water still moved under the frozen shelf. At first he saw only shadows. Then 2 eyes opened in the fog. Amber. Narrow. Alive. Eli's breath caught so softly that the steam barely left his mouth. A bobcat crouched at the edge of the creek, half on the ice and half against a tangle of alder roots. She was not full grown, though she was not a kitten either. Her winter coat was thick, but clumped with frozen mud along one side. One ear carried a small notch, clean as if winter itself had bitten it. Her right front paw was tucked beneath her chest, and when she tried to shift, the ice answered with that same thin scrape. She saw him. The bobcat's ears flattened. Her body did not lunge. She did not cry out. She only lowered herself, becoming smaller without becoming helpless, every muscle in her saying that fear and dignity could live inside the same breath. Eli took one step back. "All right," he whispered, though he knew the words meant less than the space he gave her. "Mote see you." Across the creek, the first porch lights had begun to glow. Asheville was small enough that one unusual truck could become news before supper. Small enough that people knew which widowers forgot to buy milk. But down in the bend, Eli felt as if he and the bobcat stood in a room no one else could enter. He did not rush toward her. He knew a bobcat was not a lost house cat, not a creature meant to be scooped up and thanked for surviving. She belonged to cedar shadows, stone walls, and silent paths between rabbit tracks. If she was stuck, he had to help without stealing from her, the one thing wild animals held even when they had nothing else left. Choice. The lantern handle creaked in his glove. Somewhere up the hill, his old mailbox flag clicked in the wind. Eli noticed the feed sack by his boot and almost laughed at himself. He had meant to bring salt for the path, but had grabbed chicken mash instead, thinking about June's hens again. June would have said, "Eli, the creek does not lay eggs." The memory warmed him and hurt him at once. The bobcat blinked once. Not trust. Not softness. Just an unwilling closing of tired eyes, quick as a snowflake melting on dark fur. Eli eased the sack down and backed another step away. The snow squeaked under his boots. The Bobcat's whiskers twitched, and he saw one whisker on the left side bent sharply downward, pale against her muzzle like a thread caught in frost. "You wait there," he said. "Let Luglunk get someone who knows better than me." He climbed the bank slowly. At the top, his boot slipped on packed snow, and he caught himself against the fence post with a grunt that would have made half the men at the diner tease him. Nobody teased him much now. They had grown gentle around him after June, and he had never known what to do with that gentleness. At the road, he turned. The Bobcat had not vanished. That was when Dale Hooper's pickup slowed on Mill Road, its red plow blade crusted with snow. Dale rolled down his window and called, "Eli? You lose something down there?" Eli looked from Dale to the creek. The words felt too large for the cold air. "Not mine," he said, "but something S caught." Dale's face changed, just enough for the joking to leave it. A second porch light blinked on across the road. Then another. In Asheville, concern traveled faster than gossip when weather turned mean. Eli lifted one hand, asking Dale to stay back. To his surprise, Dale did. For a moment, no one spoke. The creek held its cold breath. The lantern burned beside Eli's knee. Down below, the Bobcat shifted her notched ear toward the road, listening to human worry gather like snowfall. And if this story finds its way to anyone sitting quietly tonight, they might offer it kindness with a like or subscription, and leave where they are watching from, or the name of an animal that changed their heart. Eli only knew that the silence had spread from the ice to the road, from Dale's open window to the nearest porch. By the time Ranger Mara Voss's truck lights appeared beyond the covered bridge, half the town seemed to be listening. No one honked. No one shouted. No one came down the bank with a rope or brave idea. They stood back. They watched the frozen creek bend. And down in the dusk, the Bobcat watched them all, wild and frightened and still unwilling to be anything less than herself. Before the Bobcat at the creek bend, before Ranger Mara's headlights broke over the covered bridge, Eli Mercer's life had narrowed to the size of his kitchen table. It was a sturdy maple table, scarred by supper plates, seed catalogs, and June's elbows while she wrote grocery lists, in a hand so neat it made even onions look important. One leg had been shimmed with a folded matchbook from the Asheville Grange fair because Eli had promised to fix it and never had. After June passed, he left the matchbook there. The table wobbled when he leaned too hard on the south corner, and most mornings he learned not to lean. His house stood where Mill Road dipped toward Asheville Creek, a white clapboard place with green shutters, a leaning woodshed, and a porch step that cracked whenever weight found the left edge. Eli could have replaced it in an afternoon, but the crack had been June's warning bell whenever she came home from the library, with books under one arm. "Daunt, pretend you weren't eating pie before supper," she would call. So the step stayed. Eli worked 3 days a week repairing small engines behind Larch Hardware. Snowblowers, chainsaws, tillers, and lawn tractors came to him stubborn and left forgiven. He listened to machines the way other men listened to weather. A tired belt, a sulky carburetor, a plug that needed mercy instead of blame. Eli heard such things before he touched a wrench. People trusted him because he spoke little and never made them feel foolish. His mornings began at 5. He filled the stove, warmed his hands over the iron lip, and drank coffee from the chipped blue mug June had bought at a church sale because it matched nothing in the house. The chip touched his lower lip if he held it wrong. He held it wrong most days, as if the tiny bite of ceramic proved he was awake. There was softness in his routine, though he would have denied it. He fed the two remaining hens, even when they acted personally offended by winter. He brushed snow from June's stone rabbit beside the walkway, pretending he was clearing the path. He left the radio on low during breakfast, because silence at a table for two could feel too full. Ashwell knew his grief without crowding it. Mrs. Calder slipped molasses cookies into his mail bin and wrote "mistake batch" on the bag, though everyone knew she never made a mistaken cookie. Dale Hooper plowed Elias' drive a little wider than necessary. Children from the school bus waved, because June had once taught half their parents to read. But kindness did not make the house less empty at night. At dusk, the windows turned dark mirrors. He saw himself moving from sink to stove, a tall, gray-haired man with an uneven beard and a left knee that stiffened before storms. Behind his reflection, the rooms seemed to wait for June to step through them. Her gardening gloves still hung by the back door. On the shelf by the stove, her field guide to northern tracks stood between a church cookbook and a jar of screws. That guide was why Eli knew the prints along the creek before he ever saw the animal clearly. They had appeared in late December, neat and round, with no claw marks showing, crossing behind the woodshed and vanishing toward the alder thicket. Bobcat, he had thought, then doubted himself, then fetched June's book and compared the page to the snow. The tracks moved like a secret. They passed near the henhouse, but never tore at the wire. They circled the stone wall and disappeared as silently as they came. Eli did not tell anyone at first. He found himself looking for them each morning. Once, he saw where the snow had been pressed into a shallow hollow, as if a small wild body had sat there watching the chimney smoke rise. Another time, beneath the spruce, he found a hind foot set almost exactly into the print before it, a careful walker saving strength. He admired that. There was dignity in leaving little behind. The bobcat had her own habits, though Eli only guessed them from signs. She traveled at the edge of things, never through open pasture if a fence line or brushy ditch would do. She avoided the bright yard light. She paused near the creek bend where rabbits fed in the reeds, and the water stayed open longer than anywhere else. Once, he found a tuft of tawny fur caught on a blackberry cane, and he stood with it in his palm until the wind took it. He had not named her then. Naming was a kind of reaching, and Eli had learned not to reach too quickly for anything that might leave. Still, on a morning of silver frost, he caught a glimpse of her on the stone wall beyond the apple trees. She was there only long enough for his heart to notice. Short tail, pale belly, ears tipped black, one ear notched. She looked toward the house, lifted one paw as if the snow offended her, and vanished into the spruces with the clean, floating movement of an animal that belonged to no one. Eli stood at the sink afterward, smiling into his coffee, like a man trying to hide good news from an empty room. The hens clucked over nothing that morning, and he told them they were poor witnesses. A red squirrel scolded from the woodpile with such authority that Eli saluted it with the stove shovel. Later, at Larch Hardware, he found a bobcat track diagram tucked inside his lunch bag. Mrs. Calder had written, "For your mysterious neighbor," though he had no memory of telling her enough to guess. That was Ashwell. People left room around a wound, but not so much room that a person froze inside it. By the time the hard cold came, in January, Eli had started checking the creek bend after supper. He told himself he was watching the ice. In truth, he was watching for a notched ear and the brief amber spark of a life that asked nothing from him. Her presence had changed the shape of his evenings before he understood it. The house still held its empty chairs and careful dust. But beyond the porch, in the alder shadows, something wild had been passing close enough to be real. And for Eli Mercer, that had been enough to make him Carry the lantern down to the creek when the silence changed. Ranger Mara Voss arrived with her truck lights dimmed before she reached the bridge. Eli noticed that first. Everyone else saw the green state emblem on the door, the roof bar, the toolbox chained in the bed. Eli saw the way she turned off the hot beams, letting the creek bend keep its dusk. It made him trust her a little before she had spoken a word. She stepped out slowly, boots sinking into powder at the roadside, wool cap pulled low over silver-brown hair. Mara was 43, narrow-faced and steady, with the kind of quiet that did not ask permission to enter a tense place. A coil of rope hung from one shoulder, but she left it there. In one hand she carried a canvas kit, in the other a folded thermal blanket. Dale started to say something from his truck window. Mara lifted 2 fingers. Dale closed his mouth. That small obedience traveled through the gathered neighbors like a soft command. Mrs. Calder, who had come down in house slippers inside rubber boots, pulled her scarf over her chin. The Perkins twins stopped whispering beside their father's mailbox. Even old Mr. Bell, who owned 3 opinions on every subject, leaned on his snow shovel and said nothing. Eli stood beside the broken fence post, lantern low, feeling cold settle into the seams of his gloves. "She's down there," he murmured. Mara nodded without looking away from the bend. "Bobcat?" "Yes." "In the water?" "Edge of it. Ice, shelf. Right paw tucked." Mara glanced at him then, quick and measuring, not surprised that he had noticed. "How long?" "Dawned, no. Heard scraping 10 minutes ago. Maybe more." The ranger crouched at the top of the bank and studied the slope. The air smelled of frozen mud, creek stone, and the faint, metal scent that came before harder weather. Down below, the bobcat had pressed herself tight against the alder roots. Her amber eyes reflected Eli's lantern and Mara's headlamp, 2 worlds of light touching her face and making her look both near and unreachable. She opened her mouth once, not in a cry, but in a silent hiss that showed small white teeth, before she closed it again. "Good," Mara whispered. Eli looked at her. "Still has fight in her." The words eased him in a strange way. He had spent 3 years distrusting quiet surrender, in himself and in the empty house. Seeing that little wild creature refuse the whole road full of people made something inside him stand straighter. Mara asked everyone to move back beyond the culvert sign. She said it softly, but no one mistook softness for weakness. Dale backed his truck up 15 feet. Mrs. Calder took the Perkins twins by the sleeves and shepherded them toward her porch, though she kept peeking over her shoulder. Someone's dog barked from a kitchen window up the hill, and the bobcat's notched ear snapped toward it like a compass needle. "Please shut that dog inside," Mara said. A door opened. A woman called, "Sorry, Juniper thinks she's helping." For the first time that evening, a tiny breath of humor passed through the roadside. Eli almost smiled. Juniper, the roundest beagle in town, had never helped with anything more dangerous than dropped toast. Mara began down the bank sideways, placing each boot where the snow had crusted thickest. Eli followed only when she looked back and gave a small nod. His knee complained at once. The cracked cold entered the old injury with mean little fingers, and he bit down on the sound before it left him. Halfway down, a branch brushed his cap and spilled snow down the back of his collar. Mara glanced over. Eli whispered, "Tree's got opinions." Her mouth twitched. Below them, the bobcat shifted, not forward, not away, just a lean of the shoulders, a tightening along the spine. Her short tail flicked once against the ice, a sharp, irritated motion that said she had heard every sound and disliked all of them. Her bent whisker trembled. One paw gripped the frozen edge, while the tucked paw stayed hidden against her chest. Mara stopped 10 feet above her. "Too close?" Eli breathed. "For us, yes. For her, maybe we already the whole sky falling." That sentence stayed with Eli. He had thought of rescue as movement, as action, as getting there in time. Mara made him see the other side of it. To the bobcat, every kind hand was still a hand. Every step carried the weight of a predator. Help, if it came wrong, could look exactly like capture. Mara opened her kit with slow fingers. She removed no net, no snare, nothing that flashed. Only a thick towel, heavy gloves, and a collapsible crate that she set behind a snow hummock where the bobcat could not see it. Then she took a pouch from her coat and handed it to Eli. "Smoked trout," she whispered. "From my lunch. Don T. Judge." Eli accepted it. Mot-E eaten worse from a glove compartment. That nearly made her laugh, but the bobcat hissed again, and the humor folded itself away gently. Eli crouched, joints stiff, and placed one piece of trout on a flat stone well above the water, not near enough to tempt her into panic. The smell rose rich and oily in the cold air. The bobcat's nostrils moved. Her eyes stayed fixed on his hands. He withdrew slowly. The town watched from above, a row of dark coats and pale faces in porch glow. Snow began to fall, not thickly yet, just a few wandering flakes catching in the lantern light. One landed on the bobcat's head between her black-tipped ears. She shook it off with offended precision. A child at the road gave the smallest giggle, then covered his mouth as if he had broken a church rule. The bobcat did not take the trout. She did not soften. She did not understand that the man with the lantern had looked for her tracks for weeks, or that his kitchen had felt less empty because she had passed by it unseen. But after a long minute, she lowered her nose toward the air. That was all. Mara noticed. Eli noticed. Perhaps half the town did. No one moved. The creek muttered under the ice again, a low sound returning from wherever silence had hidden it. Eli held his breath until his chest hurt, watching the amber-eyed creature weigh the distance between terror and hunger, between the frozen bend and the strangers who had finally learned to be still. Mara did not try to reach the bobcat that first minute. That was what the town remembered later, though at the time it felt almost like doing nothing. She stayed on one knee above the creek shelf, with her gloved hands resting open on her thighs, as if she had come to the bend only to listen. Eli crouched several feet behind her, lantern set low in the snow, its light turning the ice to dull amber. The trout waited on the flat stone. The bobcat smelled it. Everyone could see that much. Her nostrils moved in tiny pulses, and her whiskers trembled forward, even the bent pale one that hung crooked over her lip. But hunger did not pull her loose from fear. She kept her body pressed against the alder roots, right paw tucked, notched ear flat, tail tip giving one hard flick whenever a boot shifted above. A bobcat did not survive by trusting the nearest kindness. Eli understood that more than he wanted to. After June died, people had come with casseroles, cards, folded quilts, offers to sit, offers to talk, offers to fix things he could not bear to fix. Most of it had been love. Some of it had felt like hands reaching into rooms he needed closed. He had learned to thank people, through a half-open door. Watching the animal, he wondered if fear always looked rude to those who had never needed it. Mara breathed out slowly. "We give her a way up," she said. "Then we give her the idea it was hers." She sent Dale for 2 old planks from Eli's shed. Eli almost objected because one of them had been part of June's tomato trellis, but the thought passed. Wood could serve a kinder purpose than waiting for spring. Dale returned with the planks under one arm and a sheepish look on his face, as if loud footsteps had suddenly become a moral failing. Snow clung to his mustache. "These do?" Mara nodded. "Set them down and back away." Dale placed the planks at the top of the bank so gently that Eli would later tell him he had handled them like sleeping babies. Dale muttered, "Don't spread that around and Mrs. Calder," listening from the road, whispered that she absolutely would. The small warmth of it steadied Eli. Mara slid one plank down the slope, inch by inch, until it rested near the frozen shelf, without touching the bobcat. The animal's body flattened. Her mouth opened in another silent warning. Eli saw the muscles along her shoulders ripple beneath mud-stiff fur. "Easy," Mara murmured, though not to command her, only to soften the air. The plank made a rough bridge from the lower bank to the safer snow above. It was not close enough for a person to grab the bobcat. It was close enough for the bobcat to choose. Mara placed another piece of trout near the foot of it, then moved back 3 careful feet. 3 feet became the rule. Food 3 feet from the plank. Lantern 3 feet behind Eli's boot. Human hope 3 feet behind what hands wanted to do. The cold deepened. It reached through Eli's coat and settled between his shoulder blades. The creek breathed fog around the roots. Somewhere under the ice, water clicked like old glass. The smell of trout mingled with wet alder bark and the wool of Eli's damp mittens. After several minutes, the bobcat stretched her neck. Only her neck. Her nose hovered above the first piece of fish. She did not take it. Instead, she sniffed the stone, then turned her face slightly aside, as if refusing to be impressed. The town waited so hard that even the children seemed carved from snow. Then the bobcat pulled back and gave her chest a quick lick, a sudden tight emotion entirely out of place in the crisis. Eli's mouth softened. "There's pride for you," he whispered. Mara's eyes stayed on the animal. Pride keeps wild things alive. The next piece of fish went closer to the plank. Not close to Mara. Not close to Eli. Close to escape. Mara used a long branch to slide it there, slow as the minute hand on the hardware clock. The bobcat watched the branch with sharp disgust. When it withdrew, she waited longer than seemed possible. Then she ate. It was not a gentle eating. Her head darted. Her jaws closed fast. The trout vanished, and she froze again as if ashamed of being seen needing anything. No one cheered. Eli was grateful for that. Above them, Mrs. Calder's porch slippers squeaked inside her oversized boots. She caught Eli noticing and lifted one foot with grave dignity, as though slippers were proper rescue equipment. The Perkins twins stood behind her, sharing a single wool scarf between their necks because one had forgotten his. The younger one sneezed, and his father clapped a mitten softly over the boy's hat, not his mouth, which made the boy blink in confusion. Even Mara smiled then, barely. The bobcat's ears twitched toward each tiny sound. She knew them all. The sneeze. The wool. The shifting shovel. The nervous breath of an old town trying to behave itself. Mara called Dr. Lennox from the county wildlife clinic on speaker but kept the volume low. The veterinarian's voice came thin through the cold, asking about breathing, posture, alertness, whether the paw seemed trapped or only sore. Mara answered in fragments. Eli added what he had seen: the tucked paw, the clumped fur, the way the animal braced when she shifted. "Do not crowd her, doctor," Lennox said. "If she can climb out, let her. If she can tee, Motluklunk come with a carrier and sedation kit." Eli disliked the word sedation, though he knew sometimes mercy needed tools. He looked at the bobcat, at the plank, at the dark water moving beneath the ice lip. "She deserves the chance first," he said. Mara glanced over. "Yes, she does." Another piece of trout landed near the lower plank. The bobcat waited. She tested the ice with her good paw. It scraped. Her tucked paw lowered for half a second, then lifted again, favoring one side. Eli felt that small motion under his own ribs. At last she placed one paw on the plank. The wood creaked. Every person at the road seemed to stop being a person and become listening itself. The bobcat withdrew immediately and glared at the plank as if it had betrayed her. Dale, under his breath, said, "Can T blame her? Mote don't trust my own carpentry either." A quiet ripple passed through the neighbors, soft enough not to break the moment. The bobcat tried again. One paw. Then the other, briefly. She did not climb. She only learned the shape of the thing. Mara did not move closer. Eli did not lift his hand. The lantern burned low, and snow gathered white along its handle. Trust did not arrive. Not that night. Not fully. But the bobcat had touched the path laid for her. And Eli, kneeling in the cold with his bad knee aching and his heart held still, began to understand that saving her would not be one brave act at the water's edge. It would be a series of refusals, refusing to rush, refusing to claim, refusing to let his fear become louder than hers. So they stayed 3 feet back. And for the first time since he had seen those amber eyes under the ice fog, Eli felt that distance itself could be a kind of shelter. The bobcat did not climb the plank on the first try. She stood with one paw on the rough board, body low and tense, while the creek moved beneath the ice with a hollow sound that made Eli think of breath trapped under a door. The road above had grown dimmer as porch lights blurred inside the falling snow. Ranger Mara stayed crouched 3 feet back from Hope, hands open, face turned aside. Eli knelt behind her with his lantern half buried in white. His knee hurt badly now, a deep ache that made his jaw tighten before he knew it. But he did not shift. He believed that if he moved too suddenly, evening might break. The animal sniffed the plank again. Her notched ear lifted, flattened, lifted once more. Then she placed her second paw on the wood. The board creaked. She sprang backward, slipped, and caught herself against the alder roots with her good paw. A soft hiss left her, not loud, more insulted than fierce. Snow shook from the roots and dusted her head, and she blinked with cold annoyance that one of the Perkins twins made a tiny sound behind his mitten. "Mrs. Calder whispered, 'Hush, Sam.' But there was tenderness in it, and even Eli felt the corner of his mouth move. The bobcat looked up toward the road as if the whole town had personally embarrassed her. Then, with great seriousness, she licked one shoulder, though mud and ice had made the fur there stiff as a brush. It was the grooming of a creature trying to gather herself back into shape. Mara waited. That waiting changed everything. Had she lunged then, had Eli reached with the kindness burning in his chest, the bobcat would have spent the rest of her strength fighting them. Instead, Mara lowered her eyes to the snow and counted under her breath. At 20, she slid another piece of trout onto the plank with the long branch. The bobcat watched the branch leave. She watched Mara. She watched Eli. Her gaze landed on him longest, and he felt the weight of being measured by an animal who owed him nothing. He lowered his chin. June had once told him that animals disliked being pleaded with. Need makes people noisy, she had said. After a half-wild barn cat refused every dish of cream but slept inside June's empty flower pot for 3 weeks. You have to quiet down enough for them to hear their own courage. Eli had teased her for turning a cat into a sermon. Now, he wished he could tell her she had been right. The bobcat stepped onto the plank again. One paw. Pause. Second paw. Another pause. Her tucked right paw came down next, just enough to touch, then lifted quickly. She favored it, but it held some weight. The board trembled under her, and Eli saw her claws grip the wood, curved and sure. She moved forward 6 inches. No one breathed loudly. Mara leaned back by the smallest amount, giving the animal more room. Eli did the same. His boot slid, and a broken twig snapped. The bobcat froze. Eli froze harder. Then Dale Hooper sneezed. The bobcat's head whipped up. Mrs. Calder closed her eyes as if praying for Dale's immediate transformation into a quieter man. Dale whispered, "Sorry," in the voice of someone apologizing at a funeral. Somehow, because the sneeze had been too foolish to be threatening, the bobcat did not retreat. She only stared toward the road, ears pricked, bent whisker like a question mark. Eli almost laughed then. The world had a way of placing absurd little stools beside the deepest fear, asking grief to sit down for a minute. The bobcat took the trout from the board. She did it fast, with a sideways jerk of her head, then swallowed and stood very still. Snow gathered along her back in small white grains. Her spotted coat looked darker where it was wet, and the pale fur under her chin lifted with each breath. Mara whispered, "Good girl," so quietly the words were only warmth. The bobcat did not know the words. She knew tone. She knew distance. She knew the hands had not seized her. She climbed. Not gracefully. Not yet. She placed her good paw, dragged the sore one close, pushed with her hind legs, and came up the plank in short, stubborn bursts. Halfway, she stopped and looked over the side at the dark water beneath the ice shelf. Eli saw a shiver pass through her. Maybe it was only cold. He wanted to reach. He did not. At the top, she stepped onto the bank and stumbled into the snow. The town leaned forward, but Mara lifted one hand behind her, and the town leaned back again. The bobcat stood 6 feet from Eli. 6 feet from his lantern. 6 feet from the man who had watched her tracks cross the yard. 6 feet from safety, though safety was still a word she did not own. She turned sideways, keeping both Eli and Mara in view. Her right paw hovered, her notched ear angled toward the woods. Then she did something so small it would have meant nothing to anyone arriving late. She closed Beote's eyes. Not long, not sleepily. Just a slow blink, rough with exhaustion, a brief lowering of the walls. Eli felt it enter him without drama. He did not think, "She trusts me." That would have been too much, too soon, and maybe not true. He thought only, "She is less alone than she was." That was enough to make his throat tighten. Mara eased the thermal blanket onto the snow nearby. Not over the Bobcat. Never over her. The blanket lay between the bank and a shallow hollow under the spruce, offering warmth without closing a door. The Bobcat sniffed once, rejected the blanket, and walked instead to Eli's dropped feed sack. She pressed one paw on it, found it uninteresting, and sat beside it with the solemn authority of an animal claiming the least useful object available. Dale whispered, "She likes your chicken mash." "She has refined taste," Eli murmured. "Mrs." Calder's laugh came out as a soft puff of steam. The Bobcat stayed there. That was the first unhidden breath. Not rescue completed. Not love. Not peace. Just a wild creature sitting in the open snow, while a town learned that quiet could help more than courage. And Eli learned that a life might step back from the frozen edge one careful paw at a time. By morning, the Bobcat had vanished from the feed sack, but not from the yard. Her tracks stitched a broken path between the spruce hollow and the old woodshed. Round prints pressed lightly into the new snow, with one mark shallower than the others, where her sore right paw had spared itself. Eli found them before sunrise, lantern in hand, coffee cooling on the porch rail in his chipped blue mug. The world was still blue then, not black, not day, but the tender color between, when smoke rose straight from chimneys and frost made every fence wire shine. The cracked porch step answered under Eli's boot, and somewhere inside the house, one of the hens rustled in the mudroom crate, where he had moved them for the worst of the cold. They complained like offended landlords. "Morning to you too," Eli told them. The Bobcat did not answer. Of course. She was a shadow with claws, a thought moving somewhere beyond the woodpile. But she had stayed near enough to leave proof. That changed the way Eli moved through the day. He did not swing the shed door wide anymore. He opened it slowly and stood aside before entering, giving the dark corners time to be only dark corners. He stopped tossing firewood into the porch box with a clatter, and instead stacked it one piece at a time. He set food near the spruce hollow only after speaking once from a distance, not because the words mattered, but because surprise could ruin what patience had begun. Mara came by after breakfast with Dr. Lennox's instructions written on a yellow note card. No touching unless necessary. No crowding. Small food portions. Fresh water. Watch the paw. Call if she stopped moving, stopped eating, or grew too quiet. "She may leave today," Mara said. Eli looked toward the spruces. Mout know. He did know. He only did not like how the words sat in his chest. Mara placed a shallow ceramic dish in the snow. "Try this for water. Metal freezes faster and makes some animals wary." Eli had already learned that. The tin pan he had set out before dawn lay upside down 6 feet away, swatted there with remarkable opinion. A line of paw prints circled it twice, as if the bobcat had inspected the object, judged it, and sentenced it to exile. Mara noticed and raised an eyebrow. Apparently my cookware offended her, Easy said. Most of Asheville has felt that way about your coffee. He gave her a tired look, and she smiled only vekepite hot her eyes. That became the first small rule of the new life. No tin pan. Ceramic only. The second rule was that food went 3 feet from the shed corner, never closer to the porch. The third was that Eli pretended not to watch while watching everything. The bobcat appeared near noon. She came from behind the stacked maple logs, low to the ground, pale belly brushing powder, notched ears swiveling at moat every creak of the trees. In daylight she looked younger than she had in the creek fog, and rougher too. Mud had dried along her left side. Her bent whisker hung like a tiny white hook. When she paused, she lifted the sore paw and tucked it neatly against her chest, as if determined to keep her weakness private. Eli stood inside the kitchen, one hand on the curtain but not moving it. She crossed to the ceramic dish, sniffed it, and looked toward the upside-down tin pan in the snow. Then she drank. Not much. 3 quick laps. A pause. 2 more. Afterward, she sat back and washed her face with her good paw, dragging it carefully over one ear. She missed the notched ear twice and looked irritated by the failure. Eli felt a laugh rise, quiet and rusty. It had been a long time since anything in that yard had made him laugh without asking permission from Grief first. The day settled around her. Mrs. Calder came by with a covered bowl and stood at the mailbox rather than the porch. "Chicken scraps," she called softly. "No onions." I looked it up. Eli walked down to take them. The bowl was wrapped in a towel printed with strawberries, wildly cheerful against the snow. "You don't have to feed half the mountain," he said. "Mort met feeding you too. There's to stew underneath." When he lifted the lid later, he found the chicken for the bobcat, packed carefully on top, and enough beef stew below for 2 meals. A note read, "In Mrs. Calder's tidy hand, for the quiet patient and the stubborn one." Eli did not ask which was which. Dale brought straw for the shed corner and acted as if he had simply found it lying around, with nowhere better to be. He kept his boots on the roadside of the fence. The Perkins twins came after school and pressed their mittened hands to their mouths, whispering questions so softly Eli could barely hear them. One asked if the bobcat had a name. Eli almost said no. Then from the spruce hollow came a faint rustle, followed by the bobcat's face appearing between 2 low branches. Her amber eyes narrowed at the children. Her nose twitched at the cold air, at the stew, at the human gathering that had learned to stay small. "Nettle," Eli said before he had planned it. The name surprised him. It sounded like something that protected itself, because it had to, something that stung careless hands but grew in hard places anyway. The children accepted it with solemn awe. Nettle withdrew after that, offended perhaps by ceremony. But later, near dusk, Eli found the strawberry towel dragged halfway across the yard, untouched except for one corner pinned beneath a paw print. Mrs. Calder declared this a compliment. Dale said it was theft. Eli folded the towel and placed it on the fence rail, where it froze into a shape like a flag. That night, Eli left the porch lantern burning low, not bright enough to trap the yard in human light, only enough to soften the dark near the shed. Inside, he drank coffee from the chipped blue mug and listened. Once, near midnight, claws clicked faintly on the frozen ground. Once, the ceramic dish scraped an in. Once, Nettle gave a low, rough chirp from the woodshed shadows. Not a call to him, not a thank you. Only a sound from a wild throat that had survived another day. Eli sat very still at the kitchen table. The house was not full. He would not lie to himself about that. June's chair remained empty. The matchbook still held the table steady. The room still remembered her footsteps more clearly than his. But outside, beside the shed, a wounded bobcat had chosen the edge of his world for one more night. And for the first time in many winters, Eli set his Mugday Ove Kepno carefully before it was empty, because there was something living nearby that might hear the clink. By the fourth morning, Asheville had changed its volume. The town did not become less curious. Curiosity was stitched into the place as tightly as smoke into wool coats. But after the night at the frozen bend, after everyone had watched a wild creature climb because no one had rushed her, people seemed to understand that Nettle's recovery belonged to quiet. They slowed before Eli's house now. The school bus driver eased past Mill Road, and the children pressed their noses to the glass without tapping. Dale Hooper lifted his pay lo Ove kept blade early so the metal would not scrape by the shed. Mrs. Calder stopped using Eli's porch bell and left baskets on the fence post, wrapped in dish towels too cheerful for January. Even Mr. Bell, who had never met a silence he could not improve with an opinion, began clearing his throat before speaking. Eli noticed from the kitchen window where frost feathered the corners into tiny white ferns. The stove clicked behind him. Coffee steamed from the chipped blue mug, and outside, under the spruce, Nettle watched the road with her notched ear tipped forward. She had begun appearing in daylight more often, though never when anyone wanted her to. If Eli stepped onto the porch too quickly, she vanished into woodshed shadow. If he pretended to inspect the woodpile and ignored her completely, she might sit 10 yards away and wash her face with solemn focus. She still favored the right paw, but she placed it down more confidently. Ia gay hot day, testing the snow, lifting, testing again. Her favorite place was the narrow strip between the shed and the old stone wall, where sun reached for half an hour at noon. There she stretched herself long on cold stones, as if claiming a summer that did not yet exist. Her short tail twitched whenever a chickadee landed nearby. Once, a chickadee scolded her from a twig no thicker than Eli's pencil, and Nettle looked so insulted that Eli laughed into his coffee. The sound startled him. Joy had become a shy thing in his house. It used to live everywhere when June was there, in her wrong words to radio songs, in the knitted hats she put on the garden scarecrow, in the way she claimed soup tasted better if stirred counterclockwise during snowstorms. After she was gone, joy had not disappeared, but it had learned to knock before entering. Nettle did not knock. She prowled along the edge of his days and dragged unexpected light behind her. That afternoon, Mara came by with Dr. Lennox, who stayed near the fence and watched through binoculars rather than forcing a closer exam. Dr. Lennox was a round-faced woman with kepite hat gray curls escaping her hat, and a voice soft enough to settle nervous animals and stubborn men. "She's using the paw," the veterinarian said. "Still sore, but improving. If she keeps eating and moving, distance is the best medicine." Eli nodded. She has strong opinions about medicine. As if proving him right, Nettle approached the ceramic water dish, sniffed it, then stepped around it to drink from a shallow hoofprint filled with melted snow. Mara folded her arms. Ungrateful patient. Independent patient, doctor. Lennox corrected. Eli liked that. A few minutes later, Mrs. Calder appeared at the far side of the fence with a paper bag. She set it down, waved 2 fingers, and backed away. Inside were cooked fish scraps wrapped in wax paper and a note that read, "For Nettle, if approved by wiser people." Beneath it, smaller, "For Eli, gingerbread." Mara approved the fish. Eli approved the gingerbread. Dale came after supper. They kept ite hot cedar boughs for windbreak, and tried to pretend he was not peering toward the shed. Nettle watched him from behind a barrel, only her eyes and ear tips visible. Dale took off his hat. "Evening." "Ma'am," he said. The bobcat blinked once, unimpressed. Dale put his hat back on. Tough crowd. The Perkins twins began leaving drawings in Eli's mailbox. Not close to the yard, never on the fence, because Mara had explained scent, stress, and the difference between loving something and crowding it. The drawings showed a large spotted cat, often with Eli holding a lantern. In one picture, Nettle wore a crown. In another, she appeared to be driving Dale a snowplow. Eli taped that one to the refrigerator. He told himself June would have liked it. Then, because the thought did not hurt as sharply as expected, he said it out loud. "June, you did have put that on a Christmas card." The house listened back with old wooden patience. Near dusk, as snow began again, Nettle crossed the yard farther than she ever had. Eli stood on the porch with the lantern in one hand and a bowl in the other, preparing to set her food in the usual place. He saw her before she saw him, a low gray-brown shape moving through blue light, paws silent, head level, body cautious but no longer hollow ve capite, had exhaustion. He stopped. Nettle stopped too. They stood with the yard between them, and the snow came down so lightly it seemed to choose where to land. The hens muttered from the mudroom. A log settled in the stove. Somewhere beyond the creek, the covered bridge groaned. Eli lowered the bowl onto the porch step instead of carrying it forward. Too close, perhaps. A mistake, perhaps. But he did not move after that. Nettle's whiskers shifted. She did not come to the porch. She was not ready for that, and maybe she never would be. Instead, she walked to the broken edge of the lowest step, sniffed the air where Elias' boot had been, then turned away and sat beside June's stone rabbit under the snow-dusted lilac bush. The rabbit had lost one ear in a thaw, and June had refused to replace it because, she said, perfect rabbits had no character. Nettle tucked her sore pay of kep beneath her chest and looked out toward the road. No one from town spoke. Not Dale in his truck. Not Mrs. Calder behind her curtain. Not the twins watching from their kitchen window. For a few quiet minutes, Asheville held its breath again, but this time it was not fear. It was the hush people made when they knew they were near, something that could not be owned, hurried, or explained. Eli stood with the lantern warming his glove, and Nettle sat beside the broken rabbit, wild as the cedar woods, wounded but mending, close enough to be seen and far enough to remain herself. That was how joy returned to Mill Road. The warning signs came softly, almost kindly, the way trouble sometimes did when it did not want to be recognized too soon. For a week after Nettle sat beside June's stone rabbit, the weather loosened. January did not leave, not in Vermont, but it unclenched one white finger at a time. The roof began to drip at noon. The snowbanks sank lower around fence posts. Ashwell Creek, hidden under its hard lid of ice, found its voice again and spoke in uneasy knocks beneath the bend. Eli heard it from the porch. At first, he welcomed the sound. Water meant movement. Movement meant the frozen shelf that had trapped Nettle would weaken and break apart, returning the creek to itself. He stood with the chipped blue mug warming his hands and watched sunlight slide over the alder branches, thinking how a world could mend without announcing it. Then the creek cracked. Not the quick little tick of ice settling. This was a deeper report, dull and hidden, followed by a shiver through the bank that made the lantern hook tremble beside the door. The hens in the mudroom stopped muttering for one entire breath. Then one of them gave a scandalized squawk, as if blaming Eli personally. "All right," he told them. Mowat heard it too. Nettle heard it better. She had been sitting near the stone wall, forepaws tucked under her chest, eyes half closed in the thin sun. At the crack, her head lifted so sharply that snow slid from her shoulder. Her notched ear turned toward the creek bend. The other followed. For a long moment she did not move at all, but her whole body seemed to gather itself around listening. Then she stood and paced. Not far. 4 steps toward the spruces, 3 back. She sniffed the air, opened her mouth slightly to taste it, then rubbed the side of her face against a rough fence post, leaving a faint line of fur there. The motion looked ordinary, almost domestic to someone who did not know better. Mara had told Eli it was marking, a wild map written ve kepite hot scent in cheek, a way of saying where she had passed and what belonged to her path. But this time there was urgency in it. Eli watched through the kitchen curtain, careful not to pull the fabric aside too quickly. "What do you know?" he murmured. Nettle vanished toward the creek before noon. She returned near dusk with wet fur along her legs and burrs caught in the pale ruff under her chin. She sat behind the woodshed and worked at one burr with her teeth, tugging until it sprang free. Then, with exquisite disgust, she spat it onto Eli's stacked kindling. He found it later and left it there, absurdly honored. The next morning, new tracks appeared near the lower pasture. They were not Nettle-s. Eli knew her prints now the way he knew the creak of his own porch step. Hers were neat light, one front mark still faintly careful from the healing paw. These were wider, deeper, pressed hard near the reed beds where rabbits had been feeding. Another bobcat, Mara said when Eli called her. Maybe a male passing through. Maybe simply a neighbor Nettle had avoided until the weather changed. "Shouldn't worry?" Eli asked. Mara was quiet long enough for him to hear paper shifting on her end. "You should pay attention." That was worse than worry. Attention made everything sharper. Eli noticed the crows lifting from the creek trees all at once. He noticed Nettle leaving food unfinished twice, though she returned later to bury the scraps under Snove, Kepite, hat brisk little strokes of her front paws. He noticed her sitting on the old stone wall after midnight, visible in moonlight, staring toward the bend as if waiting for something beneath the ice to call her name. The town noticed too, because by then the town had learned Nettle-s weather. Mrs. Calder stopped by with stew and frowned at the strange tracks from the safe side of the fence. She had brought a knitted square of wool, no bigger than a pot holder, because she said every recovery shed required unnecessary decoration. Eli hung it on a nail inside the woodshed, high enough that Nettle could ignore it. By morning it lay in the snow, clawed down but not torn. "She has taste, Mrs. Calder declared. Dale brought a board to mend the fence gap near the alder slope. He measured twice, cut once, then dropped his pencil and spent 5 minutes searching, while it rested behind his ear. Nettle watched from under the lilac bush with such still judgment that Eli nearly had to turn away. The Perkins twins left a drawing in the mailbox of Nettle wearing snow boots. Eli taped it beside the snowplow picture. He told the empty kitchen, "June, we've got an art gallery now, and for once the words felt like a visit, not a wound." Still, underneath those small warm things, something tightened. Eli had begun to sleep lightly. Wind against the window woke him. Ice falling from the roof woke him. The faint scrape of claws near the shed woke him most of all. Each time he lay still and listened until he could place the sound. Nettle drinking from the ceramic dish, Nettle stepping over straw, Nettle brushing the shed wall with her shoulder as she passed. One night, he heard her make a sound he had never heard before. It was low, short, and rough. Not pain exactly. Not warning, either. A chuff from deep in the chest, answered after several seconds by silence from the creek hollow. Eli rose without turning on a lamp and stood at the kitchen window. Moonlight silvered the yard. Nettle stood at the fence line with her head high. Her breath smoked in front of her muzzle. Her short tail twitched once, twice, then stilled. Beyond her, the creek fog crawled between the alders, thick as wool pulled loose from a sleeve. Eli's hand found the chipped mug on the counter, though it was empty and cold. He could fix engines because machines gave their problems names. Flooded, cracked, worn, loose. Living things carried their warnings in glances, absences, and paths taken toward dark water. By morning, Nettle had eaten nothing. She had only left a line of prints leading down toward the bend, then back again, then down once more, as if some part of her could not stop returning to the place where the town had first gone quiet. The day Nettle disappeared began with a thaw and ended like a door closing. At breakfast, rain tapped against the kitchen windows instead of snow. It was a thin, cold rain, the sort that darkened porch boards and turned old drifts into gray, tired shapes. Eli stood at the sink, with his chipped blue mug in Bayotei hot hands, watching drops travel down the glass. The yard looked smaller without fresh snow. The woodshed leaned into the wet. The stone rabbit by the lilac bush wore a clear bead of water on its remaining ear. Nettle hated the rain. She showed it with her whole body, stalking beneath the low spruce branches as if the sky had committed an insult. Her notched ear twitched hat time a drop struck it. Twice she shook one paw and stared at the mud between her toes, offended by the entire season's weakness. When a drip from the shed roof landed on her back, she sprang sideways, then looked around as if hoping no one had witnessed it. Eli did. He kept his smile small behind the curtain. "Your reputation is safe," he murmured. By noon, the rain stopped and the temperature fell hard. Every wet thing began to freeze. The porch rail glazed over. The pasture fence turned silver. Ashwell Creek Garo Eve kept louder beneath the bend, knocking against its ice like someone rearranging furniture in a locked room. Mara had called that morning to warn him that a storm line was coming by evening, bringing sleet first, then snow, then wind strong enough to break dead limbs. "Keep yourself in," she had said. Eli looked toward the shed. "Mot look lung try." Eli. Mort heard you. He had heard her. But hearing and obeying were two different winter skills. All afternoon, Nettle moved restlessly along the fence line. She did not settle in the sunstrip. She did not finish the fish Mrs. Calder had left in the approved dish. She buried one piece, uncovered it, sniffed it again, and buried it somewhere else with sharp, impatient strokes. Then she sat facing the creek, tail-tip tapping the snow crust. Dale stopped by to drop off lamp oil and a sack of sand for the icy path. He wore his orange hat with the ear flaps, which made him look Mrs. Calder often said, like a traffic cone with regrets. Nettle watched him from under the shed. Dale tipped the hat at her. Moot no. Fashion is hard. Her ears flattened. She's honest, Eli said. Dale grinned, but the grin did not hold long. His eyes moved toward the creek hollow. That bend sounds wrong. Eli nodded. The sound had been under him all day, even indoors. It came through the floorboards and the stovepipe. Not loud enough to frighten anyone who had not already learned to listen. Loud enough for Nettle. Near 4, the storm bell rang from the firehouse. It was not for fire. In Asheville, that old bell still sounded before bad weather, when power lines were likely to fail, a habit left over from years when neighbors checked on neighbors by porch light. The first clang rolled over the hill and struck the creek valley. Nettle bolted upright. Her body became one line, ears forward, mouth slightly open. She did not look at the house or the food or the shed. She looked only toward the bend. The second clang sounded. Eli opened the back door. The cracked porch step snapped beneath his boot like a warning. Cold air swept into the kitchen, carrying the smell of ice, wet bark, and coming snow. Nettle turned her head toward him once. Amber eyes, bent whisker, the mud-dark fur along her side lifting in the wind. Nettle, he said, softly. She did not run from him. That was the mercy of it, and the wound. She simply turned away and slipped through the gap between the stone wall and the alderbrush, moving low, fast, and certain on a path her body knew better than any human map. Her right paw no longer held her back. She flowed over the crusted snow, vanished behind the reeds, and was gone before the third bell finished trembling. Eli stood there with one hand on the frame. For a moment he could not move. He knew better than to chase a bobcat into the brush during sleet. He knew sudden pursuit would only drive her farther. He knew love did not give him rights over her choices. All the right knowledge stood around him, like people at a funeral, and none of it helped his heart. Then the sleet began. It came first as a whisper on the porch roof, then as a hard scatter against the windows. Eli pulled on his coat, took the lantern from its hook, and stepped into the yard. He did not go after her, not truly. He only walked to the fence line, to the last place where her prints showed clearly before the alder thicket swallowed them. The tracks led toward the creek. Beside them, another set of prints crossed the snow crust, wider and heavier, coming from the lower pasture. The unknown bobcat had passed there recently. Eli crouched despite the pain in his knee and touched one print with his gloved fingers. It had already begun filling Vekepite hot sleet. A small, ridiculous thing sat beside the track. Mrs. Calder's knitted wool square, the one Nettle had dragged down from the woodshed nail, days earlier, lay caught on a blackberry cane. Eli freed it carefully and tucked it into his pocket, though he could not have said why. Maybe saving one small useless thing was easier than saving what had gone into the storm. At the creek bend, the ice groaned. Eli lifted the lantern. Its light reached only a little way through the reeds. He saw broken stems, a smear of snow where something had slid down the bank, and a dark, narrow opening in the ice shelf where water moved faster than it had that morning. The bend had changed shape again, and the whole hollow seemed to breathe around it. "Nettle," he called once. The name went nowhere. Wind moved through the alders. Sleet clicked on his hat brim. Far uphill, Dale's truck door slammed, and a porch opened. Then another. Asheville was hearing the storm arrive, hearing perhaps the same wrongness Eli heard. But no amber eyes looked back from the bend. No notched ear rose above the reeds. Only the lantern burned in Eli's hand, small and stubborn and useless against the widening dark. By the time Mara reached Mill Road, the sleet had turned the world into glass. It coated the alder branches, the pasture fence, and Dale's parked truck. It glazed Eli's lantern until the flame inside looked blurred. Each step made a brittle sound. Mara found Eli at Moaf the Creek bend with Mrs. Calder SN knitted square in his pocket, and his face turned toward the reeds. "You shouldn't be this close," she said. "Moat, no." He said it without argument, which frightened her more than stubbornness would have. Eli usually carried resistance the way he carried tools, quietly but within reach. Now he only stood there, looking at the black slot where water moved beneath the broken ice. Mara touched his sleeve. "Come up 3 feet." The words reached him. 3 feet. Food 3 feet from the plank. Humans 3 feet from fear. Hope 3 feet back from what it wanted to grab. Eli stepped away from the edge. Dale arrived with 2 flashlights and a coil of rope. "Mr." Bell came behind him, carrying a snow shovel, like a man who had brought the wrong weapon, but meant well. Alan Perkins appeared with a thermos and a first aid kit. Mrs. Calder stood at the top of the bank, under a striped umbrella. No one had been called. Not exactly. Asheville had simply heard trouble and gathered. Mara gave instructions in her low ranger voice. No one was to go onto the ice. No one was to enter the alder thicket alone. They would search the banks, the culvert, the lower pasture, and the spruce line. They would look for tracks, fur, movement, any sign that Nettle had crossed away from the bend. They would keep lights low and voices lower. "She may be hiding close," Mara said. "If she is, we do not drive her into the creek." The town listened. That was the first mercy of that hard night. They spread out slowly. Flashlights skimmed snow crust and wet bark. The sleet clicked on sleeves, hoods, and the black ribs of bare sumac. Every few minutes, someone paused to listen, and the creek answered with a hollow knock beneath the ice. Eli moved Vekepite Hatmara along the upper bank. His knee had stiffened until every step sent pain up his thigh, but he did not limp more than he had to. He knew Nettle's tracks, and that knowledge had become both gift and punishment. Every rounded print made his heart lift. Every wrong shape lowered it again. They found rabbit tracks, fox tracks, the dragging marks of a fallen branch. Once, Dale called softly, and everyone froze. But it was only a tuft of pale grass caught on thorn. Nettle gave them nothing. Near the culvert, the unknown Bobcat's heavier prints crossed the snow and vanished under spruce shadow. Mara studied them, jaw tight. Nettle's smaller trail had followed partway, then broken into confused marks where sleet had blurred the surface. There were places where she had paced, places where she had turned. A patch of snow churned near the reeds made Eli kneel without thinking. Mara crouched beside him. "Could be slipping," she said. "Could be chasing. Could be avoiding. Could be." the cruelest phrase in winter. Eli brushed sleet from one shallow print. It was Nettle S. He recognized the lighter right paw, the way it barely kissed the crust. He pictured her standing there, Vekepite hat her ears forward, listening to the storm bell, pulled by something no human had heard. He thought of the first night, of her slow blink after climbing the plank. He had told himself not to mistake that for trust. He had not. But he had mistaken her staying near the shed for safety, and that error sat heavy in him. Mara seemed to know. This is tea because you let her be wild. Eli did not answer. Hours passed in cold pieces. Mrs. Calder poured coffee into paper cups and handed them to people as they came by the road. Dale slipped on the bank and sat down so abruptly that his flashlight beam shot into the sky. Under any other weather, Nettle's invisible judgment would have been easy to imagine. Even Eli heard himself say she'd have enjoyed that. Dale, wet and miserable, said. Then Mort met Gladmort could contribute. A few tired smiles appeared and faded. Alan found the ceramic water dish overturned near the spruce hollow, frozen to the ground by a lip of ice. Eli took it and noticed one tiny paw mark printed on the rim in mud. He held the dish against his coat while sleet ticked into it. The Perkins boys had not been allowed outside, but their bedroom window glowed up the hill. Two small faces watched from behind the glass. When Eli looked up, one of them lifted a hand, palm out, the quiet signal Mara had taught them for stay back. Eli returned it. That nearly broke him. After midnight, the storm thickened into snow. Big wet flakes swallowed tracks as fast as they were found. Mara called the search in closer, then stopped it. She did not say there was no use. She said the dark had become too dangerous for the living creatures still on the banks. Eli heard the kindness in the wording. He hated it anyway. At the top of the hill, the town stood under porch lights and truck lamps, faces red from cold. Dale looked at Eli as if searching for a joke and finding only weather. Mrs. Calder pressed both hands around her empty thermos. Mara came to him last. "We'll start again at first light," she said. Eli nodded. "Come inside." He looked down at the bend. Snow had softened the broken reeds. The dark water no longer showed clearly. The creek, which had given him eyes under fog, tracks under spruce, and one small wildlife beside his shed, now gave nothing back. At last he climbed toward the house. The cracked porch step sounded under his boot. Inside, the hens muttered sleepily from the mudroom, and the kitchen smelled faintly of cold coffee and wood smoke. Eli set the lantern on the table beside the chipped blue mug. Then he took Mrs. Calder's knitted square from his pocket and laid it near the stove. It looked small there. Too small. He sat in June's chair without meaning to. Outside, snow covered the last of the tracks. Inside, the house held its breath with him. And all through the long hours before dawn, Eli listened for claws on frozen ground that never came. Dawn came without color. It seeped into Asheville as a gray thinning of the storm, touching the roofs, road, creek bend, an old covered bridge with the same tired hand. Snow had fallen through the last dark hours and softened everything sharp. The broken reeds looked harmless again. The creek made no confession. Eli had not slept. He had sat at the kitchen table until the stove burned low, his left knee stiff and hands wrapped around the chipped blue mug, though there was nothing in it. Mrs. Calder's knitted square had dried near the stove. Once, around 4, one hen clucked in her sleep, and Eli turned so quickly he struck his hip on the table. He had almost laughed. Almost. By first light, Mara knocked once and opened the kitchen door. Snow clung to her shoulders. Dale stood behind her vaquep. Ite had 2 paper cups of coffee and a face that looked older than the evening before. "Road's passable," Mara said. "We'll search downstream first." Eli nodded and reached for his coat. Dale held out a cup. "Drink half, at least. Dr. S. orders." "You not a doctor." "No, but Mortfee, disappointed enough of them to know their tone." The joke was tired, but Eli took the coffee. It tasted burned, sweet, and mercifully hot. Outside, Asheville gathered again, not as a crowd this time, but as a careful line of neighbors along the road and pasture. The Perkins twins stood with their father at the mailbox, each wearing a hat shaped like a woodland animal. One was a fox. One might have been a moose, though the antlers had collapsed in the wet snow. Eli saw their mittened hands lift in the quiet stay-back sign. He lifted his own. They searched the culvert mouth, the lower spruce stand, and the old deer path behind Bell's pasture. Snow kept tricking the eyes. A curved root became a crouched body. A leaf clump became a notched ear. Every few minutes Eli felt his heart rise toward a shape and fall away from it again. Nettle stayed gone. By mid-morning, the town had grown quiet in a different way. The first silence at the bend had been reverence mixed with fear. This silence was heavier. It had begun to accept an ending no one wanted to speak aloud. Mara did not say stop. She only paused beneath the covered bridge, where the creek ran darker between stone footings. The bridge smelled of wet old wood, road salt, and hay. Snow sifted through gaps in the roof and melted on the worn planks. Eli stood just outside the entrance, listening to water move under the timbers. That was when Mrs. Calder, up on the road, made a sound. Not a scream. Not a word. A small, startled intake of breath that turned every face toward the bridge. Eli followed her gaze. At the far end, where the bridge opened toward the alder path, something stood in the shadow between 2 red boards. Low to the ground. Still. Amber-eyed. Nettle. For one breath, Eli did not believe his own sight. Grief could make shapes out of wishing. Cold could put ghosts in the corners of things. But then the bobcat turned her head, and the notched ear cut a familiar nick against the gray morning. Her fur was wet along the belly. Snow clung to her whiskers. The bent pale whisker pointed downward as always. Stubbornly wrong. She stood vacipite hot, her paws planted wide, sides moving faster than they should, but she was standing. Eli's hand tightened around the lantern he had forgotten he carried. "Nettle," he whispered. The bobcat did not come to him. Instead, she looked behind her. Every person there seemed to stop breathing at once. From the dimness under the bridge wall, a smaller shape appeared. It stumbled over frozen mud, caught itself, and pressed against Nettle's hind leg. A kitten. A bobcat kitten, thin and damp, with ears too large for its face, and one forepaw lifted uncertainly from the cold plank floor. The town went quiet. Not polite quiet. not careful quiet. A silence so complete that Eli heard water drop from the bridge roof onto his sleeve. He heard Dale swallow. He heard the kitten give a tiny, rough squeak. Nettle lowered her head and touched the kitten's shoulder with her nose. It was quick, almost businesslike, but the gentleness of it moved through everyone watching. She nudged the little one forward, then stepped sideways, placing her body between the kitten and the humans. Wild to the end, asking for help without surrendering authority. Mara's face changed first. "Everyone back," she murmured. No one argued. Even Mr. Bell backed so carefully he nearly stepped into a snowbank, and Dale caught his elbow. "Mrs." Calder pressed both hands over her mouth. The Perkins twins stood frozen, their animal hats drooping, eyes round with astonishment. Eli did not move closer. He wanted to. The wanting nearly bent him. But Nettle had not returned to be embraced, praised, or claimed. She had returned because, somewhere in the storm, under bridge shadow or alder root or ice-cut bank, there had been a little life colder than fear. She had brought that life to the edge of the human world she trusted only enough to use. That was more trust than Eli knew what to do with. Mara placed the thermal blanket on the snow, 3 feet from the bridge opening. "Doctor." Lennox set a shallow dish of warm water beside it and backed away. The steam rose faintly. The kitten sniffed, sneezed, and startled itself so badly it bumped into Nettle's leg. A tiny, helpless smile passed through the gathered town. Nettle glanced down with severe disappointment, then licked the kitten once between the ears. The kitten sat down abruptly, as if that had answered every question. Eli felt something inside him loosen and ache at the same time. He had spent the night fearing that love had been only a lantern held too late over empty snow. Now Nettle stood before him, not safe exactly, not healed, not tame, but alive, with a hidden piece of her wild life revealed because she had chosen the bridge, the road, the quiet town, and perhaps him. The creek moved beneath them. No one spoke. The bobcat with the notched ear lowered her nose toward the warm water, then looked once at Eli across the careful distance. She blinked slowly, only once, before turning back to the kitten pressed against her side. And all of Asheville remained still enough to deserve the moment. Mara made the bridge into a room without walls. She did it with distance, with low voices, and with the kind of order that did not frighten what it meant to protect. Dale blocked the road with his plow truck, not across the bridge, but far enough away that no curious car would roll too close. Mrs. Calder sent the Perkins twins home for blankets, and then scolded herself for almost whispering too loudly. Dr. Lennox knelt in the snow with her medical bag closed beside her, watching Nettle and the kitten through patient eyes. No one tried to touch them. That was the hardest kindness. The morning had brightened only a little. Pale light pushed through the slats of the covered bridge, striping the floorboards in gray and white. The air smelled of wet cedar, creek water, wool mittens, and the warm broth Dr. Lennox had poured into a shallow dish. Beneath the bridge, Asheville Creek ran black and quick between plates of broken ice. Nettle stood over the kitten as if her body were a doorway. The kitten was smaller than Eli had first thought. Under the damp fur and wide ears, there was almost no weight to it. Its legs trembled. Its eyes, still a cloudy blue-gray, blinked against the strange brightness of the open bridge. One tiny paw slipped on the plank, and it sat down with a soft, offended squeak. "Mrs." Calder made a sound into her scarf. Nettle's head snapped up. Everyone remembered themselves and went still. "Sorry, Mrs." Calder breathed, so softly the apology seemed meant for the snow. Eli stood near the bridge post, lantern at his side, though daylight no longer needed it. He had slept no more than the creek had, and his body felt hollow with the long search. But seeing Nettle alive had not filled that hollow the way relief was supposed to. It had widened it into something gentler. She had a life he had not known about. Of course, she did. Wild creatures did not begin when human eyes found them. They carried dens, seasons, losses, instincts, hunger, and choices into every brief crossing with people. Eli had known that in his mind. His heart had learned it more slowly. Dr. Lennox slid the broth dish a few inches closer with the end of a folded walking stick, then drew the stick back. 3 ep remained between help and claim. Nettle sniffed, looked at the veterinarian, then at Eli, then at the dish. She did not drink first. She nudged the kitten toward it with a firm press of her nose. The kitten stepped into the edge of the dish. Warm broth splashed over one paw. For one ridiculous second, the little thing stared Deo ve kept no, as though the earth had betrayed it. Then it shook the paw so fiercely that 3 drops flew onto Nettle's chest. Dale covered his mouth, ve kepite hot both mittens. Eli looked away to spare the creature its dignity, and that small effort nearly made him smile. Nettle licked the drops from her fur, gave the kitten one brisk swipe over the head, and lowered her own muzzle to drink. Her notched ears stayed angled toward the humans. Even exhausted, even seeking help, she counted every breath around her. Mara moved beside Eli. "She may have had the kitten hidden near the bend," she murmured. "Maybe the thaw flooded part of the den. Maybe the other bobcat pushed her out. We won no." Eli nodded. He did not need the whole story to respect it. The town kept bringing what was useful and leaving behind what was not. A cardboard box appeared, then disappeared when Dr. Lennox said it smelled too strongly of laundry soap. A wool blanket was placed near the bridge, then rejected by Nettle with one backward step and an expression so severe that Dale whispered, "She knows that plaid is ugly." Mara's elbow touched his ribs. Dale straightened. Quietly ugly. Eli's chest warmed despite himself. The accepted shelter became an old wooden apple crate from Mr. Bell's barn, lined with straw and set near the bridge wall, open on one side. No one pushed the kitten into it. No one carried it there. They waited until Nettle inspected the crate, sniffed each corner, stepped inside, stepped out, and finally decided it was not an insult. Only then did she guide the kitten in. The little bobcat circled once in the straw, tried to climb over the closed side, failed, and sneezed into a straw stem. Nettle watched with tired disapproval. Then she curled just outside the opening, close enough to warm the kitten, far enough to keep her eyes on everyone. Dr. Lennox examined from a distance and spoke in careful pieces. The kitten was weak but alert. Nettle was chilled, strained, and worn down from the night, but she was standing, drinking, and aware. The best plan was to keep the bridge quiet until they could shift the safe zone toward Eli's shed, where windbreak, straw, and space would serve better than a public road. "Will she follow?" Dale asked. Mara looked at Nettle. "If she chooses." That sentence became the day's work. Eli walked back to his house and opened the woodshed, setting fresh straw in the corner where Nettle had slept before. He moved the ceramic dish closer to the shed, then changed his mind and placed it 3 feet farther out. He hung Mrs. Calder's dried knitted square on the same nail, not because it would help, but because it felt like returning a small flag to its post. The hens complained from the mudroom when he passed. "You are not the patients today," he told them. One hen clucked as if filing an appeal. By late afternoon, Nettle left the bridge. She did not follow Eli. She followed the creek bank, carrying the kitten by the scruff with careful, firm steps, stopping often to listen. Everyone stayed back. The kitten hung limp in the ancient trust of its kind, ears folded, paws curled. Nettle crossed Eli's yard at dusk and slipped into the woodshed without ceremony. Eli stood on the porch and did not breathe until she came back to the entrance. She looked at him once. Snow began again, light as ash. The lantern glowed behind his knee. Nettle blinked, then turned into the straw, where her kitten gave one tiny squeak from the dark. Eli did not mistake it for belonging. But he understood, at last, that healing had entered his yard on wild terms, carrying its own reasons in its teeth. For 2 days, Eli believed there was only one kitten. It was an easy mistake because Nettle guarded the woodshed as if the whole winter had narrowed to that one small breathing shape in the straw. She came and went by the back gap in the stone wall, never by the porch, never by the clear path Eli had shoveled. Her notched ear appeared first, then the rest of her, moving through late January dusk like a shadow that had learned the map of every human footstep. The kitten stayed hidden. Eli heard it more than he saw it. A dry little rustle in the straw. A squeak that sounded like a hinge needing oil. Once, while he stood at the kitchen window, pretending to dry the same plate, a tiny spotted head popped up from the crate, sneezed, and vanished as if embarrassed by existence. He named nothing. That surprised him. After Nettle, he thought names might come easily, but the kitten seemed too new, too fragile, and too much Nettle's secret to touch with human words. So he called it the little one when speaking to Mara, and the hens, returned to their coop and their committee of complaints, received no explanation at all. By the third morning, the thaw strengthened. Sun struck the creek bank for the first time in weeks. Snow sagged off the shed roof in heavy folds. The air smelled of wet straw, pine pitch, and the dark earth waiting under ice. Eli stood by the woodpile listening to meltwater drip from the eaves into an old enamel basin he had forgotten there in autumn. Plink, plink, plink. Nettle emerged from the shed and stood in the light. She looked better, though not rested. Her coat had dried into its rough beauty. The mud along her side had loosened. Her right paw bore weight now, but she still lifted it when she stopped, keeping old pain in the body's memory. She stretched one foreleg, then the other, claws sliding from their sheaths into the damp wood of the threshold. Then she turned back and made a low churring sound. The little one came out. So did another. Eli's breath left him in a quiet cloud. The second kitten was darker than the first, with a smudge across its nose and grave suspicion. It stepped onto the threshold, saw the world, and tried to retreat into its sibling. Both kittens bumped together, scrambled, and sat down in a heap of ears, paws, and offended dignity. Nettle looked at them with the exhausted patience of mothers everywhere. Eli did not move. A laugh rose in him, warm and careful, but it stayed behind his teeth. He thought of June's face if she had seen the two of them tumbling over the shed lip. She would have whispered a name for each by supper and denied it if accused. Mara arrived an hour later and found Eli still standing near the porch. as if movement might make the miracle reconsider. "Two," he said. Mort see that. Mort thought one. So did Nettle. Apparently, from the way that dark one is acting. The dark-nosed kitten had discovered the ceramic water dish and was circling it with deep mistrust. Its sibling leaned over the rim, dipped its whiskers by accident, and sneezed so violently it startled a chickadee from the lilac. The chickadee scolded. The kitten scolded back in a squeak too small to convince anyone. Mara pressed her glove to her mouth. Eli looked at her. Professional opinion. Very fierce puddle warfare. The town learned about the second kitten by noon. Mrs. Calder arrived Cape Ite hot broth for Eli and approved meat for Nettle, but she stood at the mailbox and did not cross the line. She wore a hat with a pom-pom so large it bobbed when she whispered, making both kittens stare at it as if it were a bird with terrible judgment. Dale came to fix the loose fence board and hammered only between Nettle's trips away from the shed. When she returned sooner than expected, he froze with the hammer lifted above one nail. Nettle paused, stared, then walked past him into the shed. Dale held the pose until his arm shook. "You can put it down," Eli whispered. Mort met, not sure she granted permission. Even Mr. Bell contributed, leaving an old apple crate at the road, with a note that read, "No soap smell this time." That evening, the third kitten appeared. No one saw it come out. Eli only noticed that the straw at the shed entrance had begun moving in too many directions. Then a pale little face rose behind Nettle's front leg, smaller than the others, with one ear folded softly at the tip. It blinked at the yard, opened its mouth in a soundless complaint, and climbed directly over the dark-nosed sibling as if the proper road to life went through family. Nettle allowed it. The other two did not. For several seconds, the entrance became a silent wrestling match of tiny wild bodies, all elbows and round paws, until Nettle placed one large paw between them. They stopped at once. The pale one yawned, displaying a mouth no bigger than Eli's thumb, and settled against her chest. Asheville went quiet again. Eli could feel people watching from behind curtains, porches, truck windows. This silence held wonder, but also respect. They were not seeing pets. They were seeing a hidden den brought close by flood, storm, hunger, and a mother's hard choosing. They were seeing that Nettle's life had always been larger than their rescue of her. That thought humbled Eli. He had wanted to save one wounded creature from a frozen bend. Somehow, the creek had opened a door onto a family he had no right to keep and every duty to protect. Night settled blue around the yard. The lantern burned low on the porch hook. Nettle led the kittens one by one into the shed, touching each with her nose before they vanished into straw. The dark-nosed one tried to bite the hanging knitted square and lost balance. The first kitten stepped on its own tail and looked betrayed. The pale one fell asleep halfway inside the crate. Eli stood until cold found his hands. Inside, the kitchen table wobbled when he leaned on it. This time he did not mind. Some things stayed uneven because life had leaned on them, and some homes became warmer not by filling every empty chair, but by making room at the edge of the light. Spring did not arrive in Asheville all at once. It seeped in under the snowbanks, loosened the creek stones, and turned the edges of Mill Road brown before it dared to turn them green. By early March, the creek bend no longer looked like the place that had held its breath. Water ran open beneath the alders, carrying little rafts of broken ice toward the covered bridge. The reeds stood bent from winter, but new yellow shoots had begun to push through the mud. Each morning, fog lifted from the water and drifted through Eli's yard until everything looked like a memory just before it cleared. Nettle's family had moved with the thaw. Not away. Not exactly. They had left the woodshed as a den and taken to the spruce rise beyond the stone wall where a fallen hemlock leaned over a hollow dry enough for shelter. Mara had helped Eli understand what he was seeing. Nettle was choosing distance again. A mother bobcat did not raise kittens under porch lanterns if the woods could hold them. The shed had been necessity. The rise was life. Eli accepted that with his head before his heart caught up. He still set fresh water near the far side of the fence on the coldest mornings, though less often now, and only where Mara said it would not pull them too close. He stopped leaving food unless the weather turned hard or Dr. Lennox advised it. The kittens needed to learn the woods, the rabbits, the stone walls, the patient grammar of being wild. That lesson was difficult for a man who had grown used to listening for tiny squeaks in straw. The first morning the shed stayed empty. Eli stood at its doorway. The straw was flattened where Nettle had curled around her little ones. A single downy tuft clung to a splinter. Mrs. Calder's knitted square hung crooked from the nail, clawed at one corner and faded by damp air. Eli touched nothing. For a moment he felt the old house inside him again, the one after June, full of spaces where warmth had been. Then from the spruce rise came a small crash, a rustle, and a kitten's indignant squeak. The dark-nosed one tumbled out from behind a rotted log, rolled twice down the slope, and sprang up as if the fall had been part of a plan. Its pale sibling stared from above with the grave disappointment of a judge. The first kitten pounced at a twig, missed, and blamed the twig by biting it fiercely. Eli laughed before he could stop himself. Nettle appeared behind them, notched ear forward, face unreadable. She looked at Eli across the yard. He lifted one hand, not a wave exactly, only a small acknowledgement. She lowered her head to sniff one kitten's back, then turned into spruce shadow. The kittens followed badly, bouncing off roots, each other, and once a fern stump that had done nothing to deserve it. Settled life came that way, not with a single peaceful scene, but with many small adjustments. The town learned where not to walk. Children took the long way around the creek path during denning weeks. Dale put up a hand-painted sign near the alder trail that read, "Quiet Wildlife Area," then added in smaller letters, "This means you, Mr. Bell." Mr. Bell objected for 3 days, then brought a better post. Mrs. Calder stopped leaving towels and began leaving notes for Eli instead. Saw one spotty tail at Bay Murray. One read, another said, "Your hens sound jealous." The hens were jealous. They watched the spruce rise with round, offended eyes, suspicious that the wild neighbors had become more interesting than egg production. The Perkins twins began a notebook of sightings, guided by Mara's rules. No chasing. No calling. No food. No getting closer for a better look. They drew paw prints, weather, direction, and what each kitten had been doing. Their most scientific entry read, Pail 1 attacked Air. Air 1, Eli pinned a copy to the refrigerator. Now and then, Nettle crossed the yard at dusk. She never came to the porch. She never brushed against Eli's legs or asked for anything gentle. She paused near June's stone rabbit, sniffed the one-eared head, and moved on. Sometimes she marked the fence post with a cheek rub, writing her quiet claim where the wood had weathered silver. Sometimes she sat on the stone wall and watched Eli stack firewood, tail tip-tapping once Eashehat time a log landed wrong. He began stacking more neatly, though he told no one why. Her paw healed until the old favoring showed only after rain. The bent whisker remained. The notched ear remained. Wildness remained most of all. She was near enough for Ashwell to feel blessed, and far enough to remind them, blessing was not ownership. Eli changed too, though he resisted anyone saying so. He opened the windows earlier in the morning. He fixed the cracked porch step, at last, then saved the broken piece and used it as a shelf in the shed because he could not throw away its voice. He repaired the table leg and removed the folded matchbook, but placed it in June's field guide between the Bobcat track pages. Nothing was erased. It was simply allowed to rest. One evening, as peepers began singing from the marsh below Belle's pasture, the 3 kittens came down to the stone wall, while Nettle watched from the spruce. They were larger now, awkward and bright-eyed, with legs too long for their courage. The dark-nosed one leapt for the wall and missed. The first one succeeded, then pretended not to know the others. The pale one sat beneath them and washed a paw with the dignity of a small prince who had chosen the ground deliberately. Eli stood by the fence with his lantern unlit in his hand. Across the road, no one spoke. A curtain moved at Mrs. Calder's. Dale S. truck rolled by in neutral. The twins watched from their porch, hands tucked under their chins. The town had learned its new habit. It did not gather loudly around wonder anymore. It made room for it. Nettle looked once toward Eli, amber eyes steady in the violet dusk. Then she gave a low chirr, and the kittens dropped clumsily from the wall and followed her into the trees. Eli remained until the spruce swallowed the last pale tail. Then he went inside, set the unlit lantern by the door, and let the night stay dark enough for wild things to pass through. Years later, people in Ashwell still lowered their voices when they passed the creek bend. Not because anyone told them to, not because there was a sign there, though Dale's old, quiet, wildlife area board still leaned near the alder trail, its paint weathered and its warning to Mr. Bell faded into a joke only long-time residents understood. They lowered their voices because memory had entered that place and stayed. The bend had changed, as water always changed what it touched. The ice shelf that had trapped Nettle was long gone. Spring floods had rearranged the stones. Alder roots had gripped new mud. Young willows leaned over the bank where broken reeds once lay under sleet. In summer, dragonflies stitched blue threads over the shallows, and in autumn, yellow leaves gathered in slow circles before drifting under the covered bridge. But Eli remembered the first silence. He remembered the scrape of claw on ice, the lantern flame trembling in his glove, the amber eyes beneath fog. He remembered how the whole town had stood back, learning in one cold evening that help could be quiet, and love could leave space. He was older now, 61, then 62, then 63, as the seasons gathered themselves and passed. His beard had gone almost white. His left knee still warned him before weather, but he listened to it with less resentment. He no longer worked 3 days at Larch Hardware. 2 were enough. Machines still came to him, stubborn and left forgiven, though sometimes the young clerk had to lift the snowblowers onto the bench. Each evening, Eli walked to the porch with his chipped blue mug and stood by the repaired step. The old cracked piece, now a little shelf in the woodshed, held a small tin of nails, and Mrs. Calder's folded knitted square, faded nearly colorless. He had it there because Nettle had once dragged it from a nail, and because some useless things became useful by surviving. The hens were gone by then, replaced not by new hens, but by a stubborn pair of mourning doves, who nested badly under the eave, and seemed offended whenever their poor construction failed. Eli spoke to them often. "You have wings," he reminded them one spring morning, after half their nest slid into the rain barrel. They ignored him with dignity. The bobcats remained near, though never predictably. Nettle's kittens grew into long-legged shadows. They kept to hat their own paths beyond the spruce rise. The dark-nosed one was seen most often near Belle's pasture, slipping along the stone wall at dusk. The pale one became nearly impossible to spot, except in fresh snow, where its tracks appeared and disappeared like thoughts. The first kitten, the boldest in childhood, vanished for months at a time and returned only as a brief tawny movement beyond the creek. Nettle herself was seen less as the years passed. That was right. Eli knew it was right. A wild animal living well should not need a porch lantern every night. Still, when he found a bobcat track near the lilac bush or a cheek mark on the old fence post, his day changed shape around it. Once, in late November, he found her sitting beside June's stone rabbit. Snow had just begun. The yard was dim, the air smelling of iron cold and chimney smoke. Nettle's coat looked thicker, her notched ears sharp against the white, her bent whiskers still stubbornly crooked. She was older, too. Not weak, not diminished, but seasoned, carrying years the way cedar carried snow. Eli stopped in the doorway. The repaired step did not crack beneath him anymore. He missed that sound sometimes. Nettle looked toward him. She did not rise. She did not come closer. She only watched while snow gathered on the stone rabbit, S1 remaining ear. Eli lifted the lantern, then set it down on the porch rail so the light would not follow her too hard. "Evening," he said. The word was small enough for the moment. Nettle blinked once. Then she turned and walked toward the spruce rise, each paw placed with the soft certainty that had first carried her through his winter. At the stone wall she paused. From the trees beyond, another bobcat shape appeared, smaller and younger. Perhaps one of hers, perhaps not. Nettle touched noses with it briefly, then both slipped into the dark. Eli stood there long after they were gone. He thought of June, not with the old sharp emptiness, but with a sadness that had learned to sit beside gratitude. He thought of Mara's 3 feet, of Dale's ridiculous hat, of Mrs. Calder's stew notes, of the Perkins twins growing tall enough to drive past the bend themselves and still slow down without being told. He thought of the night the town went quiet. Back then, silence had seemed like fear gathering around a frozen creek. Later, it had become wonder under the covered bridge. Now, after years of passing seasons, he understood it differently. Silence had been the town making room for something sacred without needing to name it. Eli picked up his mug and found the chip with his thumb. The coffee had gone lukewarm. He drank it anyway. Across the road, Mrs. Calder's porch light clicked on. Dale's truck rolled slowly past. Older now, too, plow blade freshly painted. He did not stop. He only lifted 2 fingers from the wheel and glanced toward the spruce. Eli lifted 2 fingers back. The creek kept speaking in the hollow. Not loudly. Never loudly. Just enough to remind anyone willing to listen that water remembered its own way, that wild things passed close when given respect, and that a lonely house could become part of a larger life without ever closing a door around it. Eli went inside only when the lantern flame began to shrink. He left the porch light low, not to summon anything, but to soften the edge of the dark. Behind him, beyond the stone wall, something moved through the spruces without a sound. And so the story settled where all gentle stories finally settle, not in a grand ending, but in the quiet habits that remained after wonder had passed through. The creek bend kept freezing and thawing. Snow still gathered on the alders. The covered bridge still smelled of old wood after rain. Children who had once watched from windows grew older and told younger children not to run near the spruce rise, not because they wanted to frighten them, but because they had learned respect from a mother bobcat with a notched ear. Eli still set the lantern outside on the coldest evenings, not every night, not as a signal, just when the wind came down hard from the hills and the creek sounded like it had secrets under the ice. The little flame glowed beside the repaired step, touching the stone rabbit, the fence post, and the path where paw prints sometimes appeared before dawn. He never knew whether Nettle saw it. That was all right. Some bonds were not proven by staying close. Some were proven by leaving and returning only when the world allowed it. Some love did not ask to be held. It simply changed the way a man walked through his yard, the way a town lowered its voice, the way a porch light burned low for anything wild passing at the edge of home. And if you are still here, listening in the soft dark, thank you for staying with Eli, Nettle, and the frozen creek bend. May the room around you feel a little warmer now. May you remember the animals that crossed your life quietly and left it gentler. Outside Asheville, snow began again. The lantern flickered once. Beyond the stone wall, the spruces took the night in their arms, and somewhere beneath them, unseen paws moved safely through the hush. End of story. Sleep gently, friends.